Now we're going to turn our attention to England. England at this time was gaining in power. It had proven itself to be the dominant force of trade in the seas, the North Sea, the Atlantic, and its empires in the New World and in Africa were expanding and were making England extremely wealthy. And as a whole, England was becoming an economic and cultural powerhouse in Europe. Now, I've called this the English Baroque because it's happening in England, and its lead artist is Anthony van Dyck. However, Anthony van Dyck is not English. He is an apprentice of Rubens. So he's technically Flemish. But we see and focus on his work after he was assistant to Rubens in Flanders and he moved to London and became the court painter to the King of England. He was extremely talented young man, like a prodigy at 10 years old. We know him, or I should say, he is best known for his portraiture of the English aristocracy, and his style of portraiture is so influential to the future of, well, portraiture that we'll be looking at for the rest of the quarter. Here's him as a young man, and here he is as a middle-aged man. Look how adorable he is. Oh, goodness. So I introduce a Flemish painter for an English subject. Here. This is Anthony van Dyck, and he is the Flemish painter. But the English subject is Charles I, the King of England. This might seem confusing, and so that's why I have outlined that we can consider Anthony van Dyck part of the English Baroque because he is so influential to the establishment of portraiture in England. But we can also put him under the caveat of Flemish Baroque because he was trained by Rubens, and a lot of his style is characteristic of Rubens. So if I were to put Anthony van Dyck on an exam, I would accept both English Baroque and Flemish Baroque. What do we see here? What we see here is the ill-fated King of England, Charles I, and he stands overlooking the Thames River, which is one of the main rivers through the island of England. And he stands there with his horse and his groom and his page. Now, because I love tracing all of these lineages, Charles was married to Marie de Medici's daughter, Henrietta. What? Yes! So Marie de Medici from Italy to France has Henrietta, who then she marries off to the King of England. Oh my gosh, it's crazy, right? So we see here Charles dismounted, meaning off of his horse, and he's got his walking stick, his very fancy walking stick, and he's surveying the land. He's like this, huh? He's surveying the land. His land. King of England. Now we can see that his page is holding his jacket, right? And the groom is attending to his horse. He's taken off one of his riding gloves to hold on to that fashionable walking stick. He has a sword at his side and this dashing turn of his wrist, right? With that elbow jutting forward and this gorgeous white satin jacket as he looks out surveying England, his land. Now I introduce him as the ill-fated King of England because Charles was up against a lot. He believed himself to be the ruler as divine by God, and therefore did not have to answer to anybody. He wanted to rule as an absolute monarch, and that doesn't work well in England, where they have established a constitutional monarchy, where there is a king, and he must work within the rules of a constitution aligned with Parliament, their governing body. This share of power is not something Charles is interested in. In this portrait, we see him establishing himself as the King of England and his authority on his land that he surveys. If we look at this in more detail, Charles, how would you describe his attitude? I know you like to judge people. Refuse to stand here and look at us. How would you describe that body language? Casual? Calculated? A snob? I heard somebody say snob. Haughty. Yes. So we see like he doesn't care for us. He is above us. He's letting us look at him. He's the one on display, right? Look at how he holds his wrist here on his hip. Look what it does with that elbow. It sticks that elbow right in our face. I don't know if you've ever taken a self-defense class, but your elbow is one of the most hardest parts of your body. And it's really good at keeping people away. That's exactly what he's doing here. He isn't open to us. He's acknowledging us, but keeping us at a distance. Keep away, little peasant. Right? He's maintaining his status as king apart from us. He's even the highest or tallest person in this composition, which is quite a feat considering he was only 5'4". I know. I'm not trying to like height shame him or anything like that. But he's 5'4" and yet he's taller than his horse. The way that Anthony van Dyck very carefully composes this, he places Charles in the foreground, therefore making him the biggest, and everybody else just will automatically be smaller. He also heightens the figure of Charles by creating that kind of mound of sunlight, right? It almost creates this pedestal effect. And then the horse, which obviously is bigger than him, it's bowing. Its head is nestled down and his foot is raised. So we have almost like, Your Majesty. Oh, yes. So it plays on his ideas of absolute monarchy. The scene around this lush green, it's speaking to the lushness and the fertility of the land, the fertility of England, again reflecting on him, King of England. And the way he looks out at us, that distance, but he's also armed. He's wearing a sword. Today, when we have guns, we don't really think too much about swords, but swords are lethal weapons. And at the time, there were rules as to who could wear a sword, who could be armed with a sword. You had to have permits. And as King of England, obviously, he could wear a sword. But he's armed. He's out on a hunt and he's packing. To kind of put this in perspective, think of this as if he was holding a machine gun at his side, right? So how does he rule this land? Through intimidation, through force. His hand isn't on the sword, but it's next to it. There's this hostility. There's some tension there, isn't there? This tension is going to erupt. It's going to erupt and it's going to cost Charles his life. This is not a history class. This is certainly not an English history class. But I will tell you that there was a revolution. It's called the English Civil War. And it erupted in 1642. And Charles was captured, imprisoned, was tried and convicted of treason against the English people, and was beheaded. His son, Charles II, barely escaped with his life and lived in exile. The English established a commonwealth without a monarchy, but in 1660, this whole Commonwealth thing had just deteriorated into a giant mess, and Charles II comes back. So Charles I is dead, his son Charles II leaves, comes back in 1660, and is King of England once again. In terms of Anthony van Dyck, what we see in the artworks by Anthony van Dyck, I know we're only looking at one of them, but this establishes an attention to composition and to this presentation of these full-size figures and landscapes that the English love. They eat it up and they will use it over and over and over and over again throughout the rest of the quarter that we are together.